Karma has a timing for controlling partner. When you're in a snowdrift relationship, the cold doesn't arrive all at once. It starts as a draft under the door, little things that don't feel like much alone, but over the months they gather and turn into a wall. That's how it was with Jonah. He didn't start out cruel. He started out kind, funny, the kind of man who made me feel seen on nights when I was sure the world would forget I existed. He laughed at my jokes, remembered tiny details, made playlists for rainy mornings. He had the kind of attention that made it easy to fall in love. But love, I would learn, is not the same as consent. At first, it was loving concern. "You look tired today. Did you get enough sleep?" he'd ask. Great, I thought. Someone notices. Then it became, "You always seem tired when you hang out with your friends." A seed tucked into the ground, polished into a plant, and then left to bloom. The questions grew colder, then sharper. The language changed from curiosity to instruction. Where are you going? Who are you meeting? When will you be back? Control wrapped itself in a velvet glove, and I kept telling myself, it's fine. He cares. I kept making excuses. He's had a rough childhood. He's protective. It's just how he is when he loves you. Until one day, I realized the velvet glove was leathered and tight, and my hands were swelling. This is a story about how I stopped telling myself it was fine, how cutting loose was part survival and part strategy, and how, when karma finally tripped him, it was not some mystical strike from a vengeful universe. It was the consequence of choices and the meticulous undoing I set into motion. Not to destroy him for the sake of destruction, but to reclaim myself and show him he could not make a life out of other people's shrinking. Jonah's control was surgical. He never yelled. He never physically slammed doors. He preferred small, steady abrasion. Critical remarks disguised as jokes. A sudden, "That's not how you should do it," when I tried to cook. The way he would step between me and my phone as if he had a right to screen my messages for tone. He said, "I only want what's best for you, and I'm just trying to protect you." But protection in his grammar meant trimming my edges until I matched his silhouette. He profited off little victories. If I wanted to go out with friends, he'd text 3 supportive thumbs-up emojis. And then, at the last minute, ask for a rain check because he'd booked us a quiet night in instead. If I protested, he'd sigh like a wounded martyr. If I balked further, he'd call my friends behind my back and say things like, "She's under a lot of stress. Maybe give her some space." My phone would buzz with concerned texts from people who didn't want to upset him either. When I started looking for a better job, he applauded. Then asked me to delay interviews because we had plans. When I booked a weekend trip with my sister, he suddenly remembered an old friend arriving from out of town who needed our guest room. He staged generosity. That was always a way to bend my calendar into his favor. The strangest part was how smoothly he made my compliance feel like gratitude. He called it devotion. He positioned himself as my anchor and told himself and me that anchors were necessary. I, with my anxieties and apologies, bought the story. It took me too long to notice I was wearing a necklace woven from obligations that weren't mine. There was no single dramatic scene where I finally saw clearly. There was a Wednesday in October when the sun slanted through our living room blinds and caught dust motes like little suspended grievances. Jonah was in the kitchen micromanaging the pasta I was making, telling me how to stir in a tone that implied only a fool would disagree. He described my mother's cooking as too salty and offered to fix it. He called my sister dramatic. He'd been rewriting my life in footnotes for months, but that morning, between the smell of garlic and the quiet ticking of the stove, his words sounded like a pattern I could map. I took out my phone and opened a blank file labeled "Things That Make Me Unwell." I started to list the way he checked my messages, the way he mocked my friends' careers, the time he prevented me from taking a promotion because it would mean less time for us. Listing things was a small but furious act. It gave each slight a name and refused to let the narrative stay foggy. It took courage to write the list and more to show it to a friend. When I did, she read and then put her hand on my arm like a small, solid bridge. "That's not love," she said plainly. "That's control." Hearing it named out loud felt like a key turning in a lock. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. I was horrified that I'd let it go this far. I was furious at Jonah for making those choices and for making me complicit in my own diminution. But I was also starting to see a path away from him, not only an exit, but a reclaiming. Revenge in the movies is fireworks and dramatic monologues. Real-life rearrangements are more tedious and require patience. I wasn't out for theatrical humiliation. I wanted to remove his leverage, secure my life, and give him the consequences his pattern deserved. I wanted him to understand, quietly and inevitably, that people cannot be owned without paying a price. So I made a plan. It was a practical list, not a plot. I called it Project Ground Rules, a name that made me smile because it sounded like the sort of sober initiative I'd prefer to attach to reclaiming my autonomy rather than to any Shakespearean vendetta. The rules were simple. Collect evidence of controlling behavior and gaslighting, text threads, photos, voice notes. Keep it secure and off his devices. Rebuild my financial independence, secret savings, separate accounts, updated resume, discreet job applications. Reconnect with friends and family I drifted from. Reestablish a support network. Reduce his practical control over my daily life. Duplicate keys, change passwords, ensure I could get out if needed. Prepare a boundary-setting conversation with clear consequences if he tried to sabotage my steps. When safe and ready, exit the relationship and communicate the reasons succinctly to those in my shared life. Mutual friends, landlords, colleagues. I did not fantasize about public humiliation. I wanted his daily operations to be harder, not because cruelty makes me feel better, but because he'd structured his life around being easy for him to manage and hard for everyone else. I wanted to change the conditions so easy became impossible. I started with money because control without leverage is hollow. Jonah handled most of our joint bills and liked the look of authority it gave him when he tallied the numbers on his laptop and said, "See, we're fine." I hired a tax app and quietly set up an auto transfer to a small savings account in my name. I put in a modest amount at first, the kind of deposit that wouldn't trigger his curiosity, and increased it as I cut back on extras I'd once made sacrifices for. Expensive coffee, his designer brand gifts, needless subscriptions. Next, I updated my CV and scheduled interviews during lunch breaks. I didn't tell Jonah about the interviews. I didn't volunteer plans that might give him openings to intervene. If he asked where I'd been on a Saturday, I mentioned a study day or helping a friend. Lies of convenience are survival tools when you're trying to find your footing. I also installed a small lockbox for important documents and started taking photos of messages that felt manipulative, saving them in a cloud folder protected by two-factor authentication tied to my phone and a friendship account. Part of my strategy was documenting the erosion, the repeated jokes that were really critiques, the midnight calls demanding to know who I was with, the way he edited my social invitations. Not to create ammunition for vengeance, but to have a clear ledger of behavior that could be shown to others if I needed support. Most importantly, I reconnected. I reached out to friends I'd avoided because Jonah had complained about them being too negative. I told my sister I needed her. The first time I went to dinner with two friends without asking Jonah's permission felt like walking into sunlight after years of hunching in the shade. I was rusty at being myself in public. I'd been softened down into fit his personality, but the light was blindingly honest, and I realized I liked it. I rehearsed the conversation in my head until my words stopped being tremors and became a script. When you have to confront a person who is used to steering conversations and outcomes, preparation is the only way to keep your voice stable. "Jonah," I said one night after we'd closed the apartment door behind us, "I'm going to be frank. I feel like I've been squeezed into corners I don't recognize. I am making changes. I'm applying for jobs, managing my own money, and seeing my friends again. If you try to control me or sabotage these things, I will leave." He blinked, the way men do when they hear an ultimatum that doesn't actually inconvenience them in the moment. "You're overreacting," he said, soft and sure. "I never tried to stop you. I only wanted what's best." I showed him the list I'd kept, not as an accusation to be flung, but as a mirror. The man who looked back wore the clothes of someone who'd convinced himself that love equals direction and ownership. For a week, he apologized. He bought flowers. He promised to do better with that soft, rehearsed cadence of someone who sees that their power is thinning and wants to patch it with charm. I accepted some apologies grudgingly because I believed people can change. I also watched. People who are used to being in control have two options when their leverage starts to slip: actually change or escalate. Jonah chose escalation, the easier and more dangerous route. He started showing up unannounced at my work with half smiles and stories about how worried he'd been. He left notes under my door that sounded like care but read like surveillance. When I ignored him, he cultivated an ally, a coworker of mine who Jonah charmed with coffee and concern, but seeding doubt and making quiet remarks about my stress and instability. He began to say things like, "If you leave, you'll be over your head," in a tone that meant, "I will ensure you are." He borrowed a credit card in my name for emergencies, which later turned into a series of small purchases he assumed I wouldn't notice. He twisted community narratives in quiet rooms. "I'm the one who supports her" became, "She's dependent on me." It should have been obvious to him that escalation would only tighten the net he'd built around himself. Control has a fragile backbone. It relies on the compliance of others. Once compliance deserts it, the facade is brittle. When the first job offer came through, an honest role in a new city, the choice was clear. It would mean leaving behind a life constructed to his advantage, a rent split he'd control, and a social ecosystem he'd manipulated. It also meant stepping into a future I'd earned. I didn't make a show of leaving. There are dramatic ways to split, with bristling declarations and doors slammed for an audience. I took my cat, my lockbox, a suitcase, and the things I could carry in one trip. His ego would crave the spectacle. I gave it nothing. We had one last conversation. It was measured and cold in the way that happens when you've rehearsed, filed, and rationalized enough to keep your voice steady. "I'm moving," I said. "I've accepted a job. I move in 3 weeks." He smiled like nothing had changed. "You can't just run away," he said, as if my leaving was a flight rather than a recalibration of my life. "I'm not running," I answered. "I'm finally walking in the direction I want." He tried bribery, charm, guilt. He threatened to make my life difficult through mutual friends and, faintly, through vague talk about legal trouble tied to the credit card and shared finances. I'd anticipated this. I had documents, saved conversations that showed he'd coerced the use of the card, and a backup plan. A meeting scheduled with a local legal clinic and a trusted friend who had agreed to oversee any necessary steps from afar if Jonah tried anything. The weeks that followed were a blur of packing and tests of my resolve. He alternated between magnanimity and coldness, as if fishing for a reaction. I gave nothing. When the day came, I left a note that said, simply, "I am choosing myself." I pinned it where he could not pretend he hadn't seen it. I do not believe in karma as an external deity that slaps you for wrongdoing. I believe in consequence. When someone chooses to control and manipulate, the architecture of that life is brittle by design. He had built his life around dependency, on my patience, on my social capital, on the ease with which he could reorder plans to suit himself. When those pillars were removed, what he had left could not hold. The full text continues as you provided, ending with, "Like and subscribe, share if this happened to you or someone you know."